Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Not Alone Podcast. Today I have Kayla here with me again. So thank you so much for being here again today.
You're so kind. Thank you.
Well,
yeah.
We're excited because we're going to talk about the first church. And I have lots of questions for Kayla about the first church. And she has lots of answers. Don't you?
Well, I'll tell you if you ask me a question that I don't know, because that's a very likely possibility.
Yeah.
That there's something that I won't know, and that's good too.
Okay, so for people watching that again have never been introduced to you before, can you just again say what you finished studying?
I finished my master's in Theological Studies over a year ago, I guess, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it. It was a blast.
Okay, so it's 4 years. Right? Okay, and you often say that your first passion is the first church.
Yeah, I love it. I love history in general, just because part of it is it's fascinating, because it's so instructional. But the first church it's so rich in terms of just like experience and how it shaped and formed. Like here we are, 2,000 years later, and we're still following a trajectory that was kind of set in that window of time. And when you think about it, that's pretty amazing.
What can you pinpoint exactly what makes you so passionate about the first church?
I think it's because the very early days of the church, there was no form or set form. They were learning kind of as they went, and it was very relational. It was very fresh and very new, and structure is not a bad thing. I like structure, but they had a structure that wasn't based on traditions that had outgrown themselves, if that makes sense. And so everything that they did was very purposeful, and that is, I think, something that I love to learn from. Is if I were to get rid of a lot of the traditional history that I have, not that I would want to, because I really do love tradition and a lot, but what would it do for my faith if I was learning something fresh and didn't have something that just passed down to me, and then passed down to me, and passed down to me? And there's room for that. Don't like that, but at the same time, that time frame, they didn't have any of that, and it was a very, almost in a sense, very vulnerable time, but also a very precious and a very sacred time, where they were the first, and the groundwork that they laid out of that newness and out of that doing some things for the very first time, like I said, it's still set the trajectory of what we're doing in our faith today. And man, it's just so profound. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say they, who are some examples of who you're talking about?
Well, let's say they so after Jesus goes, and I'm doing this because it's just the association that we have. Heaven is that way.
Yeah.
Maybe not. But anyway, you know what I mean. Like when Jesus went back
to heaven.
Yeah, and after the Holy Spirit comes, they waited for the Holy Spirit.
This is in Acts.
This is in Acts. The first couple of chapters of Acts kind of describe that Jesus leaves them, and they wait for the presence of the Holy Spirit. They don't know what they're waiting for, but they wait like they were told. And what happened after the Holy Spirit came and not just filled the room, but filled them, was, I think, the beginning of the first church. And then the years that followed. So let's say Peter, the apostles, John, obviously James, and a handful of others who had journeyed with Jesus and who were waiting for this, were the ones, even before Paul, because Paul wasn't part of that very initial, but Paul in some ways was the father of the church, in a sense that he brought the church outwards and to the Gentiles, and taught doctrine, and kind of set a framework of teaching and of ways of meeting and of leadership So again, I mean, he would be counted in the first church, I guess, for that, because the church really took form like this. All of a sudden, it is a thing that happens beyond just we're gathering together like a bunch of friends. We're not really sure what we're doing, and then they did, and that was a lot of Paul's work and his the ones who came alongside him to kind of spearhead his missionary works. And so that kind of time frame, up until, let's say, late 60s, maybe AD, was kind of the very like grassroots level of the early church. And then, like, the years that followed, let's say maybe the 250-ish odd years that followed, would be considered like the early church time frame.
Okay. Okay, so let's just dive in a little bit deeper to what church looked like for them on a daily basis, because they basically went every day, didn't they?
Pretty often. More than just Sundays, certainly. And it was, a lot of it was based around the Eucharist. And so gathering for the Lord's Supper was a little bit different back then. It was like a meal followed by a breaking of the bread and the wine. And gathering together looked like listening to teaching, similarly, worship, similarly.
The teachings coming from
apostles, largely. Now that changed, obviously, over time, because after, let's say, late 60s, there were no more, well, maybe John. John would have been the only one that was left, but he was in exile, which is very sad for him, I'm sure. But otherwise, then it was what was passed down from those to the generation that followed, and then the generation that followed. And, men and women were raised up in terms of leadership and different roles. And so gathering frequently and abundantly, because, it was different back then. I mean, these were the people that were unique and different, and they stood out from the rest of society and found companionship and safety and family in one another. And so I would assume have spent a fair amount of time in each other's presence, encouraging one another, being present with one another, learning, worship, prayer,
And they're really learning from people that first were hanging out with Jesus for a long time.
Yeah, initially anyway. Like I said, until those were no longer available or present, and then the ones that followed branched out, and it really took off. And it was like anything, the more Christianity spread, the more loosely associated teachers and leaders would have been with the apostles and those who knew them, just because, just sheer numbers wise, in time and space.
Yeah. Okay. So when we're talking about it spreading, walk us through what that actually looks like.
Well, there's partly, I think, things spread, which sounds weird to say it that way, but
fire spreading, right?
Right. Partly, practically speaking, Paul's missionary journeys took the gospel all over, Eurasia area, maybe even as far as Spain. We know that he intended to go as far as Spain, and depending on who you ask, some would say he got as far as Rome and never made it to Spain. Others would say that he did, in fact, make it, to Rome in prison, then was let out of prison, went to Spain, and ended up back. Whatever. Anyway, but when you think about where Jerusalem is and Spain is, that kind of span of territory, there's a lot of space for one man's missionary journeys, which is amazing. So partly the church spread that way through the sending of Paul, particularly, and maybe some others like him as well. No, he wasn't the only one who went out, but so there's mission, the actual going out, missional, and then there's actually the lives of the believers themselves that spurred on just the rapid growth and spread of Christianity in those early days.
Let's talk about Constantine. Teach us about Constantine. Keeping in mind, lots of people have no clue who this is.
Constantine, what an interesting individual. So Constantine was an emperor in about the early 300s-ish AD. And how he became that way is actually quite a fascinating story, but
Okay, share.
Well, that part is long. Is it now less relevant to actually his impact on the church? Well, maybe not, but kind of. But at any rate, well, part of it was he ended up winning a series of battles, one in particular, largely because, in his own words, he heard the voice of God giving him instruction, and things turned a certain way, and he was victorious, and it associated him with, almost even from that moment on, as a God-fearing or a God-led leader. But he also, though, was the first emperor to really, not just because up until that point, I think there were about 10 waves of, just different waves and different levels of, almost like state-sponsored persecution against Christians. And that looked like different things under different leaders. And sometimes it was quite brutal and sometimes maybe less so.
Could you just make state-sponsored persecution?
Okay.
Break that down.
So, like government sanctioned, for lack of a better way to say it. So, just like anywhere, you can have persecution against a people group, but the government is not either behind it or would be opposed to it and would actively seek to end it. But with the early church, the Roman emperors, and they weren't actively trying to, and they're actually actively spurring it on for a variety of reasons. But when it came to Constantine, he was the first one who actually not only ended persecution against Christians, but actually eventually made it just state religion. So now they were gone from this really intensely persecuted people to enjoying immense privilege and freedom that they hadn't up until that point known before. And that was largely because of just edicts that he put in place for their protection, and also just even the proclamation of Christianity as in association with Rome, which, when you think about it, compared to where they were coming from, is quite remarkable. And also, again, depending on who you'd ask, some people would argue that he did this largely for political reasons. And there would certainly maybe be evidence that would suggest that to be true. There are also some people who say, no, he was a Christian and God-fearing. And maybe, he certainly, I think he was the one who called himself the 13th apostle. He was quite sure of himself in terms of his place in the scheme of things and leadership in the church. And that, in terms of daily life for Christians, that was not necessarily a bad thing because it made life easier, but it also kind of started to pave the way for this connect between state officials, leaders, secular leaders in government, and the church. And so Constantine would preside over church councils, even though he wasn't a bishop. He wasn't a church leader. He was the emperor, but he would be present at these things as well. And so I don't know that I personally love that per se in terms of it's complicated. Should a government official, using our own lingo today, preside over a meeting to do with Christian doctrine in Christian matters? Well, probably not the best. But he also was very influential in the spread of Christianity, but for an entirely different reason, in terms that it almost hit the point where if you weren't Christian, you were persecuted. Go figure,
So if you're not Christian, then you are persecuted.
Loosely persecuted. And so, which it changed, obviously, just the state of being for the church, but it also removed a lot of the outside pressures that made the early church what it was. Wow. And was very refining. A lot of that pressure was very, it really made you choose. There's no neutral ground, right? There was either, you're kind of you're in or you're out. You were a Christian or you were not. And for a variety of reasons, there was no neutral ground. Partly because those who were really devoted to Jesus made it difficult if you were kind of half-in. They weren't necessarily easy on other believers who would say, I'm a Christian, but I'm also going to sacrifice to the emperor because they thought emperors were gods, right? And just to appease them. And because I believe in Jesus, but I also don't really want to get in trouble, and so I'll do this one thing. Well, that didn't go over well, And so there was no neutral ground for a whole variety of reasons. Like you're going to embrace the Christian faith. You were taking on a lifestyle that would subject you to a whole variety of different pressures and persecutions that looked like a lot of things. And that changed under Constantine, where you didn't necessarily have to be so in or out anymore. It was kind of the start of that. And where you could be Christian openly, but it changed the dynamics of faith and what it cost, I suppose. And you can look at that both ways. Well, should Christians be persecuted for their faith? Like, what about like our own like freedom of belief and all these different things? But it actually did very good things for the church when they realized that my life is not my own, and I've laid down my rights and handed them over to Jesus. And whether I live or I die, there's no longer my decision. I will follow him and this path, no matter what. And whether it's my right to be protected or not, it's no longer up to me. And so that, under that mindset, though, in those first few hundred years, is what the church actually just exploded under. And after kind of that post-Constantinian era, it just changed in terms of, that was when actually, over time, with stories of the desert fathers wandering off into the desert, they were, in a sense, seeking a different kind of persecution. Because they realized, like, if I stay in the city, life is way too easy. It is so easy to be distracted, so easy to be lukewarm. I need to find a way to, if no one else is going to bring external pressure, I need to go wander off to the desert to find it myself, in a sense. That wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly one of them for a lot of them.
And these were referred to as desert fathers?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like those ones, like the desert fathers and mothers who just kind of almost like sought refuge from the secular, what the church had become, but also what the world had become, and they took off. And part of it was because they really did seek a life that wasn't easy, and it was just too easy now, and they saw that it was doing damage to faith. Now that's extreme. Nonetheless, it was kind of that post era of like, now all of a sudden everything's different. It doesn't cost Christians anything to be Christian at all anymore. And they it kind of spurred off that whole monastic movement, which throughout that, which was needed, I suppose, in the hundreds of years that followed to sustain the church. But that kind of started under that switch under Constantine.
Okay, so if we can go back to the persecution piece,
Mm-hmm.
it's always described that it was very intense, the persecution.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, what did that look like? How would you describe this in multiple ways? And considering as well that, I mean, like, for example, today it's easier to spy on people because of technology, cell phones,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of stuff, but that was not available in the very beginning days.
Mm-hmm.
So what did some of that actually look like?
Well, part of it was that like Christians just stood out because of their lifestyle. They're a little easier to spot in some ways because their lives were quite different, especially under the Roman Empire and what that time frame looked like under the Roman Empire. So Christians looked different. They weren't necessarily the hardest to find. And persecution could look like, I mean, it wasn't always Christians being fed to lions at the games, but that was certainly part of it. Sometimes it looked like a loss of property, loss of job, jail time, a loss of privileges, and didn't always necessarily end in death. But that also depended, I suppose, on the emperor and how intense they were on really trying to minimize or eliminate what they called a strange, actually atheistic religion, just because like Christians follow one God, whereas the Romans follow many, and so they actually thought that Christians were atheists, and which was just, and on top of that, they didn't honor the emperor as a god, and it's not that you don't honor him as again using kind of our language, an elected official, because we know biblically we have to honor our elected officials. That's biblical. Paul says it, Peter says it, but it kind of hits that kind of that endpoint when it's just like, now sacrifice to me like you would a God. And Christians were just, they couldn't do that.
No.
That was no longer an option.
No.
But that didn't necessarily go over well.